When Karoline Leavitt arrived for the interview, she came prepared for an argument. Little did she expect that it was going to end up being something so explosive, it would get one of America's most recognizable TV anchors off the air overnight. She was live in the studio, not in some recording session where she could be shut off, recorded over, and smoothed out afterward. No, this was a raw, real-time, completely unfiltered live broadcast. Karoline Leavitt had been invited onto The Morning Current, a political talk show known for its sharp debates and even sharper hosts. The man across from her, veteran journalist Paul Danning, had made a career out of pushing buttons. His interviews were aggressive, his style relentless. He hadn't come there to simply moderate, he'd come to win, and today his opponent was a young, rising conservative voice who would not yield. The segment predictably enough began. Karoline was pressed on her position on media bias, taking aim at supposed false information peddled by conservative outlets, yet claiming other networks, like hers, were merely correcting the record. She shot back with facts, instances of stories being manipulated or omitted or downright lied about in mainstream news. It was tense, but professional. For a moment, it was just another spirited debate. But then, something changed. Paul leaned forward, his expression tightening. His tone, once measured, took on an edge. He was no longer debating, he was attacking. "People like you," he said, his voice laced with frustration, "are the reason this country is backsliding. You push this fake narrative of victimhood, pretending conservatives are being silenced when in reality you're the ones silencing everyone else." The studio went silent. Karoline blinked, her posture still composed, but her eyes sharpened. She had handled aggressive interviews before, but this was different. She let the moment hang in the air before responding. "Excuse me?" Paul didn't. Back down. In fact, he doubled down. "You act like free speech is under attack, but what you really want is control." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The damage was done. The energy in the studio shifted. The producers, once passively observing, now exchanged glances. The crew members stiffened, waiting to see what would happen next. And Karoline? She didn't shout. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply said, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by your people?" The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Paul hesitated just for a second, but a second was all it took. Cameras were still rolling and the world around him was online. Paul Danning was not a man to back down. His whole career had been built on controlling the conversation, directing it where he wanted. But this time, he had let go of the reins. When he uttered those two words, "your people," something had shifted. It wasn't a poor choice of words. It was the inference behind it, the kind of phrase that could be picked apart, twisted, and replayed 1,000 times over. And Karoline knew it. She sat back, folding her hands in her lap, giving him the space to either correct himself or sink deeper. Paul inhaled sharply. "I meant conservatives," he said too quickly. "People like you, who push an agenda of grievance instead of progress." Karoline leaned forward a bit. "Just to clarify then," she said, her voice controlled. "When you said your people, you were not referencing any more than just political philosophy?" Paul's mouth compressed into a thin line. He'd played the game too long not to recognize the feel of being snared in. If he denied it, he risked reinforcing the very thing people were already thinking. If he admitted that it was a mistake, he looked weak. So instead, he shifted the goalposts. "Oh, come on, Karoline, don't play the victim here," he let out a dry chuckle. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This bad faith outrage. You know,
Exactly what I meant, but instead of engaging with the actual argument, you'd rather twist my words and make it about you." Karoline didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him redirect.
I don't need to twist anything, Paul. Your words speak for themselves." A flicker of something crossed his face. Irritation, maybe even a hint of regret. But he had gotten himself so far into this quagmire. There was no possibility for him to reverse himself at that point. Therefore, the error he did make. "You know what? Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And there was a blanket statement he delivered arrogantly on air. The studio was filled with suffocating silence on one side, while thousands of, soon millions, were on the other end watching. Paul almost seemed to grasp at a fraction of a palm, second after the word left his lips. His mouth opened wide to temper it, but was in vain. She let the words hang in the air for a beat before answering. "You're saying conservatives don't contribute to society, Paul?" He let out a deep breath and rolled his shoulders back. "I'm saying this constant whining about being canceled is exhausting." Karoline nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, but her silence said it all. The damage had been done, and within minutes, the clip would take off across the internet. It didn't take long. The moment the segment ended, the first clip started hitting social media. A 15-second snippet of Paul Danning's words. Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society. It spread like wildfire. No context, no prelude, just that sentence. Within an hour, the hashtag started trending. Fire Paul Danning, art media bias exposed, Karoline was right. Some took it at face value, blasting Paul for what they saw as outright disrespect. Others rushed to his defense, saying that it was misinterpreted. Still, the whole video did not help him in his case. Rather, it made it worse. Political analysts on both sides jumped on him. Some denounced him outright, while others spun it as another case of selective outrage. But irrespective of the stand, one thing was clear, that people were watching. And then the sponsors started to get into the fray. By midday, 3 main advertisers for the Morning Current pulled out their commercials, issuing formal statements about examining their deals with the network. By evening time, 5 others had done likewise. It had become damage control mode, at its finest. Meanwhile, Paul didn't say anything, at least yet. But for the network, it was crunch time. For Karoline, that was enough said. She just retweeted the clip, adding nothing but a thinking face emoji. But the storm wasn't over yet, because now the network had to make a decision. Inside the headquarters of NBS News, the network behind the Morning Current, executives were in full-blown crisis mode. The outrage wasn't dying down, it was intensifying. Viewers were flooding the network's email inbox, demanding action. Advertisers were no longer pausing sponsorships. They were pulling out completely. And to make matters worse, other networks began piling on, using Paul Danning's comments as a case study on media arrogance. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The network had 2 choices: defend Paul and risk more fallout, or cut ties and protect their reputation. For several years, Paul had been one of their star personalities, one of their ace interviewers, a veteran known to deliver hard-hitting interview results. Now, he had become a liability. 3 p.m. Officially, a release. Paul Danning is suspended indefinitely during an internal examination of the issues that arose over yesterday's show. NBS News will be committed to balanced and respectful reporting. Corporate code for how bad does this get before we toss him to the sharks. But the net had little patience for token gestures. Suspending wasn't enough, firing was needed. And Karoline? She wasn't leading the charge, but she wasn't stopping it either. Later that evening, she appeared on another show where she was asked directly, "Do you think Paul Danning should be fired?" She paused, then said, "I think people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words." It was measured, strategic, and devastating because the next morning, NBS News made its final decision. At 9:15 a.m., they posted, "Effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors." The media world went haywire. Some called it justice. Others called it overkill. But one thing was for sure. Paul Danning was done, and the talk had only just begun. Paul was gone, but the storm was far from over. The firing of one of America's most recognizable conservatives split the nation in 2. One half rejoiced in it as long overdue, a sure sign that figures in the media could no longer talk down at half of this country and remain unaccountable. For these people, the comments of Paul were not simply offensive, but telling. A look inside the haughty attitude that characterized mainstream media for decades. The other side called it cancel culture at its worst. So a man loses his job for one comment, a single misstep? What happened to debate? What happened to context? Right-wing commentators took full advantage. Headlines on conservative outlets painted Karoline Leavitt as the woman who took down Paul Danning. Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Newsmax ran segment after segment dissecting the firing. Meanwhile, left-leaning figures tried to distance themselves from Paul, but some were quietly uneasy. Even those who disagreed with him recognized the implications, because if a veteran journalist could be fired overnight, who was next? And then Paul broke his silence. Late one evening, he released a pre-recorded video statement on social media. His face looked tired, his tone was calm but firm. I was fired because I spoke the truth. The media doesn't want truth, they want compliance. If you step out of line, you're gone. If you challenge the narrative, they erase you. This isn't about me, it's about all of us. The video went viral in hours with millions of views. His supporters rallied, calling for boycotts against NBS News. His critics pushed back, arguing that this wasn't some grand conspiracy. He had simply crossed a line. And Karoline? She kept quiet. She didn't gloat. She didn't engage in the drama. She let the world argue for her. But this wasn't just about Paul anymore. This was about the future of media itself. The dust was settling, but the questions Paul Danning's firing had raised, they weren't going anywhere. Days after the event, all major media houses ran think pieces and panel discussions on what had just happened. Was it justice or censorship? Some viewed it as a much-needed moment of accountability, a message that elite media figures were not above the law anymore. They argued that Paul's dismissal had nothing to do with free speech. It had to do with professionalism. Words have weight. When a journalist steps across the line, then they receive the penalties. There's no question about that. But others were unsure. They cautioned that the actual threat was not Paul Danning losing his job, but the bigger picture for the future. Are we punishing people for their mistakes, or are we erasing people for having the wrong opinions? The argument went far beyond Paul and Karoline. It became all about the viral outrage, the role of social media in shaping reality and public discourse, both precarious. And as for Paul, he was out, but not quite done. 1 month later, he launched an independent YouTube show branding himself as a truth-teller silenced by the establishment. His audience was bigger than ever. Karoline walked away, but her name will forever be associated with this moment. She hadn't debated a TV host. She had changed the game. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Was this justice served or a dangerous precedent? Did Paul's firing restore accountability, or did it prove that public pressure controls the media? And most importantly, who decides what crosses the line? One thing for sure, is this not going to be the last moment in the making? And when it comes, again and again, we'll have a question on the cards. Who is with you? What's your take on it? Paul was sacked, right? Or has this turned into the classic definition of cancel culture gone overboard? Share with us your opinion in the comments and subscribe to more of these thought-provoking stories.